Greetings. So we're going to be led this evening by Kemi Elasami, who is the Executive Director of the Laundromat Project. But just want to say a little bit about the show and about this evening. I hope you've all had a chance to see the exhibition. It's an exhibition of artists that are working on social and political issues, working with very diverse themes. My sort of curatorial model in working with the show is the various forms of communication that artists use, whether it's kind of old school, like protest posters or protest music, or very contemporary forms of communication, like Instagram, social media, apps, websites. And so we've all brought this together in the exhibition, I think, to bring together a group of 9 really impassioned artists. And for me, all of the conversation, the panel discussion, conversations, workshops, performances, everything that goes on in the space in conjunction with the show is really an integral part of the show. It brings the show to life, and it really creates conversation and dialogue. So I really appreciate you all coming here to listen to these artists. Tonight, we're going to hear from Sol Aramendi, Kevin Kaplicki of the Interference Archive, Kenneth Pietrobono, Camila Janan Rashad, and Brendan Fernandez, who is joining us from Chicago via Skype. Hi, Brendan.
Hello.
So let me tell you a bit about Kemi, and then I will turn this over to her. Kemi Elasami is the Executive Director of the Laundromat Project, which brings arts, artists, and arts programming into everyday spaces to amplify the creativity that already exists within communities. With nearly 2 decades' experience in the cultural arena, she is inspired by the immense possibilities for joy and social impact at the intersection of arts, justice, and community. Prior to joining the Laundromat Project, she was Director of Grants and Services at the Creative Capital Foundation, where she supported the work of American artists making adventurous new work. From 1998 to 2004, she was Visual Arts Center at the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis, where she organized several exhibitions, including The Squared Circle, Boxing and Contemporary Art, and she also ran their Visual Artist Residency program. In 2015, she was appointed by the mayor of the city of New York to be part of the Cultural Affairs Advisory Commission. She also serves on the board of EMC Arts. She is a graduate of Smith College, New York University, and the Choral Leadership, New York. So please join me in welcoming Kemi and the artists to the stage.
Good evening, and I'll start by saying thank you to Elizabeth and to BRIC and to these amazing artists, of which we have 5 here, and 4 other amazing artists who are part of this show that feels really important and really timely. I was particularly excited to be here this evening because one of my favorite pieces is we have Saint Sonia Sanchez and Mahogany Brown, who are looking down on us from a piece that's in the other, the cafe space. And I wanted to kind of call Sonia Sanchez into the room because she's someone who's inspired me for a long time as an artist who's very much working at that intersection of arts and justice and community. And in fact, I pulled a poem that she wrote for Elizabeth Catlett, African-American sculptor and artist who made a life of work and love in Mexico. And it's called, just kind of pull us into the room and into a different space. So it's called 6 Haiku for Elizabeth Catlett in Cuernavaca. La Señora, making us remember flesh and wind. Oh, how you help us catch breath, oh, how you help us catch each other's breath. A woman's arms climbing with colored dreams. Elizabeth slides into the pool, hands kissing the water. I pick up your breath and remember me. Your hands humming hurricanes of beauty. So I invite us to pick up each other's breath and remember each other. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I will begin. The structure is that each of the artists will have a slide, perhaps 2, and talk for about 5 minutes about their work and kind of ground us in the issues and themes that they care about and what they want to bring into the room this evening. And then we'll have a bit of Q&A afterwards and hopefully be able to invite you into that conversation. But to begin, I'll read very, very short bits of their bios. Their full bios are actually in the catalogs that are available for free and really lovely, and has featuring an essay by Elizabeth among other bits of information. So I will start with, the first person up will be Camila. And Camila Jahan Rashid works across photography, printmaking, and writing, with her practice situated within an artist-archivist framework. Rashid's archival work resurrects conflicting histories that are once painful and yet palliative in their possibilities. She grounds her personal experience of homelessness into a commutable archive, no instruction for assembly. And then the second person up will be Kenneth. In Terms and Conditions, Kenneth articulates a brand of performative socio-political critique that emerges intentionally in rather unassuming ways. He has actually lived out this narrative by wearing the 30 shirts in public over the course of 30 days, and he'll get to talk about this idea of living, walking and living in narrative. Then we'll have Saul Aramendi. Born in Argentina and based in Queens, Saul focuses on socially engaged projects that invest in the language of photography, video, and new media as tools for self-expression and change. Saul collaborates with immigrant communities to create a social space to build power. And Interference Archive, represented here by Kevin Kaplicki. Interference Archive explores the relationship between cultural production and social movements. Their OpenStack archival collection and study center includes materials such as posters, flyers, books, t-shirts, audio recordings, and moving images. I have personally spent a lot of time visiting exhibitions there and think it's an amazing space. This volunteer-run, community-supported organization was founded by Kevin Kaplicki, Molly Fair, Josh McPhee, and the late Dara Greenwald. And the last person up that will be presenting is Brendan Fernandez, joining us by Skype. Hi, Brendan. Formerly trained as a dancer, his artistic practice turns to bodily movement and language as a way to question post-colonial authorship of histories. Deploying the body, his own and others as signifier, Fernandez contests the construction of culture through performative gestures that weave language, politics, and protest in tandem. So with that, we'll begin with Camila. And I think slides will be controlled from up there.
Alrighty. So before I actually talk about this body of work, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what my practice is, and it's something that became very clear this morning as I was sending a bunch of emails that I didn't want to send, and apologizing, and a lot of them are saying, sorry for this, sorry for that, sorry for being late, sorry. And my mom has a really good habit of reminding me of how important it is to stop apologizing for taking up space and stop apologizing for just being a human. And so in thinking about that in relation to my work, a lot of my work is about being unapologetic about taking up space, and being unapologetic about refusing things as they are offered to you. And so in this installation of work, No Instructions for Assembly, I'm really thinking about my family's history around homelessness, but also thinking about refusing the conditions of how that story is told and refusing the conditions under which and in what spaces that story is told. And so a lot of times when you think about issues around homelessness and displacement, they become very anthropological and they become very distant. They become steeped in statistics, and the people who are actually experiencing these things get lost in a lot of the theoretical and the abstract discourse around it. And so I was interested in thinking about my family's history and how do I make this palatable to myself, but also how do I bring this to a place where it feels personal and not so deeply entrenched in something that's theoretical. Because homelessness and displacement is a very physical and visceral experience that a theory could never really unpack in a way that is faithful to the actual experiences. And so in the installation that you see behind you in the corner, basically this is, I think, the 10th iteration of it. I've been building these since 2013. I've built them in Connecticut, I've built them in New York City, I've built them in Albuquerque, I've built them in Philly, built them in a bunch of different places, and each time that I built them, something a little different happens, because that is a function of me thinking about the space and what I feel in that space, but also it's a matter of me thinking about, at this juncture in my life, what type of story do I want to tell, and what do I want to make more visible, and what do I want to make more of a gesture. And so for this exhibition, I was really interested in thinking about sort of the architecture of a space, and thinking about sort of the things I see in my own family's home, but also a lot of the things that I saw in family homes that I watched on television. And I think if you've not had a home for a long time, a lot of your understanding of what a home looks like is not drawn from your personal experience because you don't know what that looks like. And so for me, a lot of this process is also trying to think about what are the homes that I saw on television, black sitcoms during the 90s, what I could pull from that. What are television shows and movies that I saw that feature black families, and the ways that I could pull from that as a register to think about how to reconstruct my own family's history. And so in that space, you'll see a lot of different fragments. There are photographs that I've found off of eBay, at flea markets, at estate sales, as well as my own personal family photos. There are couches and other pieces of furniture that are reminiscent of the home that my parents and I and my siblings lived in before we had to leave. A lot of even the fabric that's used is reminiscent of things that were familiar to me as a child, but also some things are pulled from sort of popular culture and things that I watched, even things like Family Matters, and watching and looking at how certain things are covered in lace and other things are not, or looking at how walls are adorned to sort of gesture towards a certain type of physical space. And so in building all of these, the structure of them, they change over time because the spaces are different. So I built things that are large, that would take up this entire space, and I've built things that are very, very tiny. And I think in all those iterations of building, I'm really interested, again, in not being apologetic about taking up space. I think there's something to be said about black bodies, something to be said about female bodies, something to be said about queer bodies, in the ways that they're asked often to be smaller, to be more quiet, to take up less space, and to apologize for taking up space. And so I think about my work in the context of, if I'm building my family's living room, if I'm building any type of space, how can I be less apologetic and assertive in doing so? And I've noticed an evolution of my work over time where I don't make small work anymore. I just had a piece of work that was 10 feet tall, and I was so excited about that. I actually cried because I've never made anything that big, and I've never been so unapologetic and excited about not taking up, not apologizing for taking up space. And so we'll talk more about everyone's practice, but I think there's some common ideas around offering to the world what you want to offer versus what the world is telling you to offer out.
Hi, is it work? Okay, there we go. Okay. Hi, I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank Elizabeth and BRIC, and really honored to be in the show with so many great artists and projects. So that's me wearing one of those shirts. So I guess my interest as an artist is in working to kind of unpack the kind of secondary texts within spaces, kind of the underlying scripts and codes and social structures that inform our bodies, our space, the way we interact with each other, the ways we interact with opportunities that are available to us. I guess to kind of connect it to some family background. My family's from Chile. They moved here in '72. They lived of mixed legal status for 20 years. So I basically grew up with this kind of receiving a certain kind of exceptionalism that I didn't quite understand or really know how it manifested and how I received it, and they didn't in a lot of ways. So, so I think my work has been this kind of ongoing investigation to figure out, what does it mean when I carry privilege? What does it mean when I carry propensity to consume? What does it mean when I carry all these ways that like my body and my engagement and my experience is kind of measured by this larger structure that isn't my own language necessarily. So I definitely feel that kind of familial interest, and I would say that I should have prepared more. This all kind of came out of actually not really having anywhere to show work. So it really just felt like, well, I have my body and I have these things that I'm thinking about and things that I want to unpack, and how can I do that in a way that I implicate myself first and foremost? that I bring as much to the conversation as I possibly can. So that way, these kind of structures of feeling can be kind of hit in a way that I'm not scripting. And the reason I think I wanted to go with this shirt, Protect Me from Disappointment, most of the shirts have a very kind of structural form to them. So these kind of like economic or political measures. And I think the thing that I don't get to talk about a lot is that it's actually really painful to wear these things for 30 days straight and not really be in control of how you're being perceived and how your body is functioning in space and the assumptions being made about you, and kind of communing with what it means to wear a shirt that says human capital and kind of see it being played out in front of you and within you. How am I okay on time? 2 minutes, okay, sorry. So yeah, so basically that's my interest with the shirt projects, and I'm sure we'll continue to talk about that more. What's on display here now is basically it's called Terms and Conditions on Wanting. So I kind of qualified it in this version, and my idea was in the first cycle that I did 4 years ago, I had a shirt that said, "Why don't we leave?" And it was one of the few kind of very affective shirts, and I decided to use this as an experiment to kind of question that myself. Like, what are these things that we're expecting from this system to give back to us? What are the deferred promises that I carry around? What are the expectations that I feel entitled to? Are they legitimate? Are they not? Does that depend on someone else's perspective? You know, all these kind of questions. So there's that, and then there's a video that I made that is just the word citizen translated into the 102 languages spoken in Brooklyn. It's cycling within the advertising screens here, and yeah, we can talk about that more, but I definitely feel that there's power in A, that word citizen, B, the fact that there's no clear definition of what it means, and that each culture has its own understanding of that term, so. Thanks.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for listening. So, as she said, my name is Sola Aramendi, and I emigrated from Argentina 13 years ago. And I created a program called Project Luz, that is a program that uses photography and art as a tool of empowerment, and also to amplify the voices of immigrants, to tell their stories, and is nomadic. So another mission is to occupy spaces where immigrants are not welcome and appropriate those spaces. I've been doing this in different places, with different communities in different parts of the world. And also by listening the people that I have as students, I also started thinking on not, as an artist, I'm committed to work around immigrant labor issues, no? So I started to think instead of just representing the issues, to start taking action on those issues. So that's in part how the project that is shown here, Apps for Power, the WageSafe app, started. I started with a conversation with day laborers. Day laborers are the people the farmers that pick up our food, the people working in the kitchens, a lot of invisible immigrant workers, domestic workers, nannies, construction workers standing in the corners. So, and wage theft in New York State happens 7 times a minute. And with day laborers, it's on epidemic levels. So I started talking with them, and that's when actually one of the union workers, we were doing a conversation with union workers, had the idea to create an application to report wage theft. So that's how I started having these encounters where together with the workers, we discussed different art strategies to fight for wage theft. And it's been a 2-year journey that you can see in the timeline. It started with one organization, growing to 11 organizations and many, many partners, lawyers, activists, organizers, and other artists. And also now since last year, the national network of day laborers also got interested in the idea to take it on a national level. So that's how the work is continuing. I'm running a worker studio with day laborers on Monday nights that we continue getting together to think different ways that we can fight these issues and educate, and also, well, involved in different projects, but all related to this. So thank you. Yes. Oh, so on April 17, we're going to have a worker studio session, a family day here, where we're going to have a lot of workshops for kids, where they're going to get the construction workers are going to be the teachers. So they're going to do some painting, tiling, and also with the idea of wage. No? Yes.
So Kevin.
So I'm Kevin Goplicki, one of the many volunteers at Interference Archive. Some of my collaborators are actually in the crowd too. Interference Archive pretty much was initiated by Josh McPhee and Dara Greenwald in their research for an exhibition they did at Exit Art in about 2009, I believe, called Signs of Change. And they had been exploring and doing research on essentially what we call the cultural production of social movements. So they were going to multiple institutional archives, museums, looking for flyers, posters, banners, any kind of like creative ephemera that's made in social struggle. And a lot of what they found was that it was hidden in some dark drawer, something like where it was kind of deemed like unfit to put on display or even archive. So they decided that they with their own collection and their own organizing would like to create an archive that would be public for all this material to be. And currently we have a space in Gowanus, Brooklyn that we've been there for 4 years, where we have a couple, like tens of thousands of items, everything from posters to buttons to music and other things that we make available 4 days a week for people to come in to do research, to come in and see the exhibitions that we mount. And in the last 4 years, we've done over 16 exhibitions on a variety of themes, ranging from graphic arts collectives during student strikes in Quebec and in Mexico, tenant union organizing here in New York City from the 50s to the present. And the idea is that we look for these forms of visual communication to try and reignite like today's activists and organizers. And it's sort of like most of these objects are created for public use and generally in the commons, so they're most likely unauthored. But if they end up in these institutional archives, they collect dust. So it's all right. In the essence of the creation of the work, we are also attempting to keep this work public, as well as the archive is also more of a social political project as well, because we are organized horizontally, we make decisions by consensus, and in doing all our programming, we are continuing a lot of I'm sorry, my brain is scattered now. But much like the social movements that we're archiving, we're organized in the same fashion. So the work behind me and the work in this exhibition is political music. And for most of us involved in the archive, music was one of the mediums that politicized this first. Like myself personally, I listen to punk rock. It exposed me to animal rights activism. It's to anti-sexism, anti-racism, and all these other it opened my perception of like what the world is about and like all these different oppressions and hierarchy. So with this show, this is actually our exhibition space, and this exhibition was called "If a Song Could Be Freedom: Organized Sounds of Resistance," and the installation we have here is "If a Song Could Be Freedom: Sounds of Repression and Resistance." So this was much more general music show from international in scope and across all mediums, but all materials from our archive. And the work that we have in here is all materials that's either about periods of rebellion or music made in prisons or under repression. And I guess that's it.
And Brendan.
Hello. Yeah, I'd just like to say thanks to everyone. Thanks for all the artists in the show for the great work, and to everyone at BRIC for this amazing collaboration. Yeah, thank you for having me via Skype. It seems strange, but I guess I'm there. I guess a little bit about my work. My practice sort of looks at the idea of movements coming from socially engaged movements, but also the way that the body moves, but also from the state of migration through the space of being an immigrant. My family is fifth generation Kenyan Indian family. We immigrated to Canada in 1989, and since then I've lived in many spaces, including the Caribbean and now New York. And I guess through my work I'm sort of questioning, as Camila said, this kind of notion of home and where home is and homemaking. And I've always sort of kind of questioned that through the sort of kind of exotification of Africa, the sort of space of my birth, the continent, but how it's always deemed as this place of the exotic, the primitive, and it's always put into this kind of context of the dark continent. Through that, a lot of my work, I'm thinking about how do we change these spaces? How do we kind of contextualize the idea of spaces? And through that, I'm thinking about, sort of the social political histories that have gone on in many of the countries in Africa. Specifically, I look at my own personal narrative being of Kenyan Indian descent and the kind of colonial history that has implied, as I've also then moved on to other places such as Canada and then the United States. I spent a bit of my time living in the Caribbean, which was a really interesting experience living in Trinidad and Tobago, because everywhere I've ever lived, I've always been somewhat of a minority. But coming to a space like Trinidad, I was automatically, as a tourist, being told that I wasn't a tourist, that I was actually a Trinidadian because I look like a Trinidadian, and I actually have a Trinidadian last name through the Portuguese Spanish colonial structure there. So for me to go to this space that had no connection to my identity, but then feeling this sort of strange kind of place of welcome. But one thing for me when I was in Trinidad was that this idea that language, even though it was a language that I knew, English, was spoken with such a heavy patois accent, Pidgin English, that it became a nonsensical code for me. So language has always been something for me as a place of power, a space to educate, a space to understand each other. And partially also growing up in Kenya, I spoke Swahili fluently. And as I moved out of that space and forgot that language, I realized that I changed, I become someone else. I'm always sort of questioning my sense of self through the process of movement, but also how movements through an embodiment can change a person. So I used to speak Swahili, but now I don't remember the language. How does one forget their mother tongue? How does one become another person? So the kind of spaces of becoming, the spaces of how do we challenge those ideas of what language can mean as a tool of power to create a commonality, a collaboration, a sense of power. The piece that's behind you, Devil's Noise, was a piece that I did research in Cape Town and Johannesburg, and I was looking at how protest can happen through the space of silence. The Afrikaans government enforced that all children would have to learn, be educated in the language of Afrikaans, the colonial hegemony tongue. And in that, people of color were only educated to the 5th grade. So if you're teaching students how to only learn in a language that's not their first tongue and only to a certain level, you're disenfranchising and disenfranchising your community and not educating them. So students in 1976 went and protested the government and had a silent protest. The protest became violent when the police let fire out onto the children and created the language riots of Johannesburg. So I'm sort of thinking about how silence can be a space of protest when we see our bodies in a space of quietude. I'm also curious about the space of stillness, because in a lot of my work regarding dance, I'm questioning the idea of the labor gesture that we perform as dancers when we're on stage or when we're performing our everyday. What is the value of that labor? So stillness as a space of labor, silence as a space of power. I'll leave it at that.
So juicy, so fun. Thank you so much for all sharing. And there's so many incredible themes, some of which we'll hopefully get to tonight. You know, the idea of taking up space and putting that up against this idea of stillness as protest and silence as protest, and how do we shift underlying scripts and how do we shape narrative, and how do we move through space without apology and be vulnerable in that, because vulnerability is just part of that when we're talking about some of the bodies that are involved in this conversation. So I'll begin with one of the things that I was really thinking about as I kind of thought about the five of you and the projects that you're presenting to, in this exhibition. I started thinking about the idea of archive, documentation, democratic history making, the idea of narrative justice, again, that idea of who shapes a story. So one of the things I'm really excited about, Saul, with your project, is this idea that you documented and really told that story. It didn't just happen. There were a lot of different people involved. How do we kind of embody and take up space? Again, going to that idea of taking up space. Interference archive. This is about, I love that it's an open stacks, it's not precious, and that's very intentional, and that idea, again, of this democratic sense of being able to uplift stories that we don't often hear. And Kenneth, just this idea of moving through space with this idea of a narrative and creating a narrative with your very body, so embodiment comes up a lot. And Camila, I know you archive and collect and have been collecting since the age of 12, these incredible photographs and ephemera, and like figuring out how do you, with each iteration, this being the 10th, you said, how do you shape each one? And in Brendan's case, the Devil's Noise piece came out of someone in 1976 documenting someone's sign, right? A placard that all these years, what are we at, 40 years later, was able to be reinvented and reformed into this piece. So just that kind of power of narrative and history and all of that pushing back and forth. So I would love to hear more about that from each of you. And I wanted to start with Saul, just because, again, this idea of, we think of documentation sometimes as being boring, like we got to take the photographs, we got to do this, and like, but it's actually, there's something really powerful about being able to take hold of that story and tell that story. So I'd love to hear how that became such a part of this particular piece.
Actually, the timeline became part of, Magnum Agency has a part that is called Photography Expanded, that is social practice photography, and they invited me to a series of meetups where we discussed the participatory practices with the idea that maybe or maybe not create a model that can be replicated in different communities. So that's through different brainstorming, we created this timeline. And also, it was very good also for me to understand the process, to have all these voices and different partners included. And it's also an application about documentation, because that is the issue for a worker when they need to prove with many things that they actually have work because the contractor is going to say, I don't remember you, I never saw you before. So I started with photography. It's also about documentation to have a proof in a case of wage theft.
Camila, could you pick up on that, this idea, just knowing that your project is about, telling a family story and telling a family history, but also telling a wider story about Black space and Black families?
Yeah. So when my family became homeless, my immediate thought was like, oh my goodness, no one's gonna know that we existed because we just lost a bunch of stuff. We lost photographs, we lost just stuff. We just lost a lot of stuff. And so I, at a very young age, became very concerned about who would actually know that we existed. And if someone were to find a box of our photos that we lost or a box of whatever that was left behind, who would care enough to even do anything with it? So since a very early age, I became interested in sort of being the family archivist and just collecting everything. So I collected everything from my older brother's report cards, stuff no one cares about. I don't need a report card from 1992 from my older brother, but to me it was very interesting and important to hold on to that as a marker that we were present, that we existed in space, and that we mattered enough for those things to be preserved. And so as I got older, I started being more selective about what I was collecting, but the impulse was always the same, the idea there being that there are tons of institutional collections. There are libraries, there are private collections, there are tons of collecting institutions, but none of those institutions are collecting anything from my family. None of these institutions are collecting anything from anyone else that I know, and I know that by the time that I'm whatever and I leave this earth, I know that my family's history won't be preserved unless I do that type of work. And for many regular people, regular Black people, that stuff won't be preserved either. And so for me, I'm really interested in thinking about the institutional archive and that being not so much pitted up against sort of a more casual DIY archive, but thinking about what it means to have a collecting institution that is very selectively collecting certain types of history, and what that means for people who have the ability to do some of that work and to fill in those holes. And so for me, it became very important to think about, well, I don't have access to a database to organize all of this stuff, and I don't have access to an entire temperature-controlled room, but I do have Ziploc bags, and I do have paper bags, and I do have shoe boxes, and I do know how to take a photo of a family artifact and then save it on an external hard drive. So these are all things that most people have access to. I do know how to post an image to Instagram, and in some way that'll go to a cloud somewhere. I'm not sure which cloud, but it will go to a cloud, and it will be preserved in some type of way. And so thinking about outside of these collecting institutions, which are hegemonic in very many ways, whether in what they collect or who is allowed to access those collections, what role do I have as a regular person in filling in those gaps? Because a lot of those stories won't be collected, and then we're left in 2018, 2020 wondering what happened to that family that lived on Carroll Street, or what happened to that family that lived on Garden Street, and having to rely on someone else to tell that story, and someone who may not be invested in telling that story from the perspective of the people who actually went through those experiences.
Kevin, does some of that resonate with the work you do at Interference?
Yeah, in a lot of ways it does. I think because we're not a singular artist in any sense, because it is a collaborative institution, we put the voice of the people that created this work ahead of our own, because we present it as it is. So there's the only narrative that we create is putting it and placing it in history, and ideally connecting it to contemporary struggles. So it's, yeah, I think that we preference the use of these items over their, over their preservation. We consider that an aspect of their preservation, is if when people see these things, they can replicate them and they can reproduce them. They can find these ideas and find these histories and try and recreate them now.
Yeah.
Or not recreate them, but ideally go out and resist.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is very much this idea of a living archive, right? That is not about hiding, but about really using it as inspiration towards new information. I've learned so much from coming to exhibitions there about movements and people, et cetera, that I didn't necessarily know. That's been incredibly inspiring to me personally. And I want to pivot to language, came up again and again, and I know is a big part of a number of you guys' work. So Kenneth, how do you select which words you want to, be out there with. And I want to connect this as much as it makes sense. And Brendan, I'm coming to you next. This idea of embodiment, because language and embodiment, there's some mix there, particularly in your work, Kenneth. So I'd love to just hear more about the experience of being embodied while carrying language. Yes, we have one less mic than people. So.
It's painful. That's all I can say. I probably started with like 250 terms and phrases that I was interested in, and just like slowly kind of whittled down. And to me, I really like this idea of like working on a micro level and on a network level, that you can kind of get something from it if you just see one, and then it also functions at this kind of larger network way. And I definitely want to get to language, because there's this little phrase I've always been addicted to that I like wrote years ago. Not that it's that important, but it's just we are the information and its record. And just this idea of like being a living archive, that you kind of carry these memories and experiences with you. And even being here to install, I didn't know Interference Archive was going to be doing a piece, and I'd be right next to it. And Violeta Parra is one of the most amazing Chilean folk singers and artists, and to see her album covers there, and that's someone that my grandmother's talked to me about, and like that, you think of these kind of social moments as being very bold and loud and quick, and you kind of realize that they actually function on these like very multiple levels of effect, where, decades later, I'm still kind of trying to tune into the vibrations of that action or like that moment. So I don't know if that, anyway, so yeah. In language, maybe I'll turn it over to Brandon to.
That's fine. So Brendan, again, you had some really amazing words around kind of this idea of language as power and silence and stillness as protest, and then knowing your own history as a dancer. So language is not only about what we speak, right? And you have a piece here that is about silence. So also that language of the body, and how just telling us more about that and how that kind of plays a role in your work, or how you get attracted to particular projects.
For sure. I think, first of all, like, dance is a language. Dance is a language that we cannot write. In the history of French court ballet, which is where ballet began in the courts of Louis XIV, we don't have the archive, or we don't have those ballets anymore, because there's no way to notate. So the camera now becomes our non-neutral, third eye that kind of captures those events, and that's just how we now learn to teach our body. So for me, there's always this kind of question of the camera document and how that participates in that space of performance. And that's how, when I learn repertoire, or I'm teaching repertoire to other dancers, it's always through the camera document. And so the sort of lack of language is something that is of interest to me within the dance space. But even within that, like, I'm really curious about, the embodiment when I'm performing, the sort of ideas of pain, pleasure that kind of happen. When a dancer's on stage, we see the dancer in this space of fortitude. Their body can never show weakness. But, our bodies are fatiguing, our bodies are laboring, our bodies are going through acts of endurance. And within that, that's kind of where I'm sort of thinking about this sort of idea of embodiment through the language of dance. And then again, this space of stillness. I think stillness and silence kind of come together for me, because as the body is standing still on stage, cultural theorist André Lepecki says that, there cannot be dance without movement. The dance can't stop. So our bodies, if you think about it in sort of this capitalist notion, the body has to keep on laboring for it to be actually dancing. But, the space of stillness, for example, in Swan Lake, the core dancers, the sort of lowest sort of company ranking of a dancer, will stay still for 20 minutes on stage, while the principal has the freedom, the allowance to move. But within that being still or standing still, is an activated space. It's not ideal, it's not being lazy, it's still an active space of endurance and labor. And so I'm sort of trying to think about that through the space of silence and protest as well.
Fabulous, thank you. I want to say huge thank you to all of the artists for a really enriching discussion.